All right, thanks everyone. So just quickly, a little bit about myself. I come from a research background. I did grad school here. I was studying cerebellar neurochemistry and trying to validate a new transmitter. At the end of 6.5 years, I was able to say probably. And I think that that's sort of what led me to be thinking that I don't really have a proclivity to the reductionist approach. I'm a more big picture thinker. So that's why I started moving into this world of knowledge translation. I was doing it before I even realized what it was. The whole term knowledge translation I think is really interesting. What I'm going to talk about today is not talk about the technical aspects of knowledge translation. There's a lot of how-to guides and stuff. We have all of that linked. There's valuable resources. There's training opportunities that I highlight. Instead, I want to talk more about the mindset and the philosophy guiding it, and really to explain why KT is needed, to tell you some sort of more conceptual things about how it's done, things you should be thinking about as opposed to thinking about as a step-by-step process, because really, as we've seen from the previous presentation, what Randy was talking about, is really it is a part of system design. And then some of my insights, some of the things I've learned sort of the easy way and the hard way as I approach this work. So can anyone define knowledge translation? I think it's really funny that the whole field is about communicating things effectively and simply, yet it has a really, really vague definition. So does anyone want to give it a try? No? Okay, well here's how CIHR defines it, and I'm not going to read it. It's a very comprehensive, thorough, detailed definition, but I think we can do a little bit better. So I think one of the key things underlying all this is really implementing research evidence. So taking stuff that we know, turning it into what we do, turning evidence into action, making something that's conceptual, turning it into real life where it can actually impact someone, closing the what we know and what we do gap. Or lastly, I think this is one of the things that really resonates with me is making research matter to somebody else. Obviously, everyone's research matters to them and their individual labs and their teams. But I think impact happens when you create something that has a meaningful effect on their own lives. So that would be my definition of knowledge translation. And I know there's a lot of people, KT scientists, that would disapprove of that. But my approach, as I said, is a little bit different. I want us to be thinking the mindset of what our ultimate goal is, right? So it has a lot of names, this field. Some people call it knowledge mobilization, knowledge implementation, integrated KT, knowledge exchange. I think all of these things sort of point to this underlying philosophy of we have to move research beyond just individual science. We have to get it back to the people who funded it and whose lives it can impact. And that's the quote that comes from this is, we're all doing the same thing. Doesn't really matter what we call it. There's nuance, but ultimately we're just trying to get research to people. So why is it needed? Well, how do we go from her, whose research is moving, colored liquids from one receptacle to another, to this young lady? And I think that's the point, is her work will not directly ever impact that person, and there's a lot of steps in the way. That is the process of knowledge translation. So how do we make sure that her research that has a benefit to this young woman will have an impact? How do we make sure that it gets there? And there's a lot of benefits to research. I mean, public funds it. There's a reason we don't call it throwing money away. We call it investment. So what are we investing in? Well, we're investing in a process. And what happens is there's a concentration of research, but it passively diffuses to public. It takes a really, really long time. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But there are real tangible benefits. If there weren't, we wouldn't continue to fund science. So there's real benefits to society by developing new tools and technology. And as I go through these, you can probably think of some in your head that come to you immediately. Helps to create companies, jobs. It stimulates the economy. It leads to our advanced knowledge and understanding of biological process, of disease, of health. It develops policies and guidelines that help make sure that we're practicing the best possible medicine or that we're providing the best possible treatments to people. And also, lastly, by doing this, we're improving individual health care, but more importantly, the health care of the entire population. You can see the countries that invest the most in RED tend to have the highest life expectancy and better health benefits. So I think that gives you an understanding of why it's needed. The point is, it doesn't just happen. Right? If it does, it passively happens. You have to wait for someone to pick up a paper or trip and fall over it and move it one step further. But I think the point that I want to emphasize through this talk is instead of it being a passive diffusion of research out to the society, it needs to be actively transported. And that's sort of what I'm going to talk about is the emerging role of knowledge brokers. People like myself, people that work at other research intermediaries like the OICR, who are actively trying to do this and trying to get research back to the people who it can actually impact. So to make another point, everyone knows the scurvy. This is the classic example of KT. The British Navy was sailing all over the world and people were dying of this horrible, horrible disease. Their teeth were falling out. It was called scurvy. It was, I can't remember the total number, I may say here, but millions of soldiers were dying. There was no idea of what the cure was, but we all know the story now that it was something really simple. It was the lack of fresh fruit, of citrus. And that citrus, we didn't actually know at the time what it was, but it was a component of vitamin C. So the first clinical trial, this is what it's referred to, the first clinical trial ever created by James Lind, determined that it was actually citrus juice that would actually help alleviate scurvy, but it took 42 years before this was actually implemented. And people think, oh my gosh, 42 years, that's a long time. But I think we can unpack why that was the case. And I think there's some things to think about. Is he was just one of many people writing about scurvy. There were many other competing ideas at the time about what was causing scurvy and how to solve it. It was an imperfect solution. Right now we have access to lots of fresh fruits and vegetables, but at the time it was really, really difficult to figure out the supply chain to get fresh citrus fruit onto a ship, and things like evaporated fruit juice didn't actually do the trick. And I think the other part is you needed partners to buy in to move it into scale. So given all of that, it's actually remarkable that this actually ever happened in the first place. But one of the things that we think about is how do we shorten this gap, right? How do we make sure that it's not half a century before what we know gets turned into what we do? And the other part of it is also in research, we want to make sure that we're absolutely right. But as I mentioned, we didn't find out that it was vitamin C until Linus Pauling discovered that some hundreds of years later. So we didn't know the mechanism, but we knew something worked. So it's never too early to start implementing something when we know. Science is always going to be trying to find better solutions, but in this case, we knew something. It just took a long time for us to actually realize why we knew it. And now there's the modern example. This is a famous paper. It's like a Jeopardy question. So the answer is 17 years. What's the question? This is the average time it takes for research from the first publication to actually reach society. And I think we can understand this because there's a lot of steps, and everyone here has a research background, so I don't need to talk you through this, but I think the point here is you need to do the research, and then that research has an impact somewhere else or has an effect somewhere else, likely with government or other agencies to develop policy and guidelines. That then influences the decision-making that changes practice and health of individuals. So there's a lot of people in between there. So how do we actually shorten that gap? And that's the big question. I don't think anyone knows, but there's approaches, and I think that's the emergence of KT, and again, emphasizing the role of a knowledge broker to sort of help carry that information forward. So I don't need to go through the KT cycle. I think this is actually almost identical to the project management cycle, because that's kind of what it is, right? If you have a goal without a plan, it's just a wish. So this gives you an articulation of how to put that plan in place. And similar to the Winston Churchill quote, plans are helpful, or planning is helpful, but plans are useless. This is a good way to think about this in terms of system design as opposed to an actual step-by-step process. These are the things you need to be thinking about before you initiate, as opposed to the step-by-step process of what you do. I think the other key thing here is there's a distillation of knowledge. So when you actually know that you have sufficient evidence and it reaches a tipping point, but balance that with the caution of the James Lind tale that we knew what it was before we actually knew what was causing the effect. And the action cycle basically just identifies the activities that you need to undertake to implement the evidence once it's been generated. So this is a conceptual thing. I think just keep this in the back of your minds. In my practice, this is sort of loosely followed. It's more thought about. If you were to try to follow this step by step, you'd find it would be very difficult. So how do we actually do it? There's two general approaches. The first is end-of-grant KT, which most people would be familiar with. This is, the idea that once you've finished your research or when your grant is coming to a close, you'll have a website that you'll publish your results on, you'll publish papers, you'll present at conferences. And again, if we think back to that original slide of that young researcher, she's probably doing that, but how is that reaching the person who she's intending to reach? It doesn't. I think it's a little bit too passive. So CIHR has taken a more comprehensive role for KT, which they call integrated KT now. And there's a lot that comes with it. One is, you need to involve your end users in helping to shape the research. So based on community needs and real world relevance, need to add some real world context to those findings so that it actually helps to be adopted better by that community. Moving those findings into practice, working with partners to translate that work, and then the broader dissemination, so engaging multiple stakeholders in understanding the evidence and figuring out how to use that. And if we think back to what Randy was saying at the beginning, that's a lot of burden to put on an investigator on top of everything he was talking about. It also might be beyond the skill set and the interest of that PI. So again, this is speaking to the need for somebody to be doing this, because again, it doesn't just happen. So what I think when KT is most successful is when it's placed in a context, a broader context of multiple different stakeholder groups. Almost if you think about it, when it's placed within an ecosystem of stakeholders. There's those who create the knowledge, the researchers, those who will use the knowledge, and that's many, many different groups of people, and importantly, those who sort of shepherd the knowledge, who are the generalists, who sort of understand all of the different players and know how to communicate across those different sectors. But I think one of the challenges is each one of these groups listed here has totally different incentives, a totally different language. They listen to different people. So I think one of the key things is to think about what would make sense to these people. What is convincing to them? So in terms of evidence, are we talking about single studies, meta-analysis, systematic reviews? The expertise, do you listen to someone who has more degrees? Do you listen to people who has real-world experience? Or what about the people who actually have the ownership of the findings and have the real understanding of what that research is showing? And the last piece is stories, and I think that we see this all too often, especially now where there's a distrust of evidence, that anecdotes seem to be more powerful. This is very well documented in the vaccine world. But I think one thing we need to remember is that while anecdotes are very powerful because they're personal, anecdotes are not the plural of data. But that said, if you can turn your research into a really good story or know someone who can, then that's a really powerful way to communicate it to a different set of stakeholders. So some insights from the real world in my own work. I think one of the key things is have a clear vision right up front that allows you to get buy-in with your different stakeholders, involve them early, and what's interesting, that creates a shared sense of purpose. So a lot of the work we do at the Ontario Brain Institute is across multiple different stakeholder groups. Our programs are built around researchers, clinicians, we have the patient community involved, we have industry partners, and they're all sort of asking the same question but coming from different angles. So if we can create that one key question to really align them and to create that shared purpose, I think that's a really powerful way to align interests and move things forward. Understanding your ecosystem, like I mentioned before, the value and the needs of the different stakeholders, their incentives, so that you can work with them to create shared wins, because it's not immediately obvious. Again, they have different incentives, they have different goals, different ways of working, different language. Partnership. This needs to be embedded in the system design. It's an ongoing thing to make sure that you're building that communication, building that relationship, and that trust. And I think that trust is that ultimate thing that underlies all of this. If you can have trust between different groups that have no intention of working together, if you can build that and maintain that, then I think you're well on your way to making sure that this research will be adopted. Another way to talk about building trust is, you start with small projects. I think one of the key things is there's a lot of enthusiasm when these things initiate. Everyone wants to go really big, but I think one thing we've learned is that if you start small and you're in it for the long run, small projects, quick wins are a really good way to show something, especially people are working in a different context than they've used to. Human resources. I think you can't underestimate the value of having people dedicated to managing the relationships, communicating across these different sectors, acting as the champions for the research program. One example is clinical coordinators. One example is, the people here on this panel. This is a lot of what we actually do. And lastly, I think important to celebrate success. Reflect and learn. We don't take enough time to pause and reflect on that stuff, but also even if something is a failure, it's never an abject fail, and there's always learning opportunities. So as a group to come together to reflect, which fits back in with the project management. So a few resources and things I point to, some of the papers and things I cited here. Some good KT resources if you want an in-depth way to plan KT projects. Also KT training, there's a lot of availability here in Toronto and across Canada. There's a lot of emphasis in this space. So if you have any questions, please let me know. But otherwise, this will be available for you to look through, as well as a larger file in the Google Drive. So thanks.